Jake Morrison never thought he would be sitting in a classroom with aliens. The 22-year-old student from Kansas looked around the huge room and felt very small. 300 students filled the space, but Jake was the only human among them. The Galactic Academic Exchange Program had picked Jake from thousands of Earth students. Only 12 humans had ever been accepted to the famous Xerion Institute of Advanced Sciences. Jake still could not believe he was here. The other students were nothing like anything Jake had seen before. The Altarians looked like walking crystals, their skin sparkling under the bright lights. They were twice as tall as Jake and moved very slowly. Their voices sounded like wind chimes when they talked. Near the front row, several nebulons floated in the air. They had no solid bodies at all. Instead, they looked like colorful clouds with glowing spots that Jake guessed were their eyes. They spoke by changing colors and making soft humming sounds. The Vextar students scared Jake the most. They looked like giant insects with 6 arms and huge compound eyes. Their bodies made clicking sounds when they moved. One of them, a female named Click, sat 3 rows ahead of Jake. She kept turning her head completely around to stare at him with all her eyes. Jake tried not to stare back, but everything was so strange. The desks were different sizes to fit, different types of aliens. Some students sat on regular chairs, others floated, and a few hung from the ceiling. The air smelled like flowers mixed with metal, probably because of all the different breathing systems in the room. The classroom itself was enormous. It could have held a football field with room to spare. The walls showed moving pictures of stars and planets. Jake realized these were probably real views of space from outside the station. A deep sound filled the room, like a whale singing. Jake looked toward the front and saw their professor arriving. Professor HFY was actually a whale or something very much like one. He floated in a huge tank of water that moved on invisible legs. The tank had speakers that turned his whale songs into words everyone could understand. "Good morning, students," Professor HFY said. His voice was deep and calm. "Welcome to Advanced Theoretical Physics. I know many of you have traveled very far to be here." Jake had traveled farther than most. Earth was on the edge of known space in what most aliens called the backwater systems. Humans had only made contact with galactic civilization 50 years ago. Most aliens still thought of Earth as a primitive planet full of dangerous creatures. "Today begins your final examination period," the professor continued. "You have studied with us for 2 galactic years. You have learned about quantum mechanics, dimensional theory, and exotic matter physics. Now we will test your understanding with our most challenging problems." Jake felt his stomach drop. He had worked very hard to keep up with his alien classmates. Most of them came from civilizations that were thousands of years old. Their technology was so advanced that it looked like magic to Jake. Their mathematics used symbols Jake had never seen before he came to Xerion. The professor's tank moved closer to the center of the room. "We will begin with a review of the most famous unsolved problem in galactic science. Students, I present to you the quantum paradox of Kepler 442. A gasp went through the room. Several students groaned loudly. Jake heard Click make a noise that sounded like breaking glass. Even the floating nebulons stopped their gentle humming and turned darker colors. "Professor," called out a Trilarian student, "surely you do not expect us to solve the Kepler 442 paradox. The greatest minds in the galaxy have worked on this problem for over 1,000 years. Professor HFY made a sound that Jake thought might be laughter. "Of course I do not expect you to solve it, student Vexai. But I want you to understand why it cannot be solved. I want you to see the limits of even our most advanced science." The front wall of the classroom suddenly filled with equations. Jake had never seen anything so complex in his life. Mathematical symbols from dozens of different alien cultures swirled together in patterns that hurt his eyes to look at. Numbers and letters twisted around each other in 3 dimensions. Some parts of the equation seemed to move on their own. "The Kepler 442 paradox," Professor HFY explained, "concerns a star system in the Andromeda galaxy. This system contains 3 different types of exotic matter that should not be able to exist together. According to our mathematics, these 3 types of matter should destroy each other instantly." Jake squinted at the giant equation. He did not understand most of the symbols, but he could see the basic structure underneath all the alien notation. It reminded him of problems he had solved in thermodynamics class back at Kansas State University. The problem is this, the professor continued. We can observe this star system with our telescopes. It exists. We can see it clearly. But our mathematics prove that it cannot exist. This is the paradox that has puzzled our scientists for 1,043 galactic years. Around the room, students were already taking out their tablets and beginning to copy the equations. Jake could hear them talking quietly to each other in their various languages. Most sounded worried or frustrated. The Trilarian Mathematics Guild spent 200 years studying this problem, Professor HFY said. They assigned their best mathematicians to work on nothing else. The synthetic collective used computer brains as powerful as entire planets. The mysterious void-touched claim that even their expanded consciousness cannot solve this riddle. Jake pulled out his own tablet and started sketching. He ignored the complex alien symbols and instead wrote down what he thought the equations were trying to say, using normal Earth mathematics. It was like translating a foreign language, but instead of words, he was translating mathematical ideas. Some scientists believe the paradox proves that our understanding of physics is incomplete, the professor continued. Others think it shows that some problems are simply beyond the ability of any mind to solve. A few even suggest that the star system is artificial, created by beings more advanced than any known civilization. Jake's pencil moved faster across his tablet screen. The more he looked at the problem, the more familiar it seemed. He had definitely seen something like this before, just much smaller and simpler. For the next 6 weeks, you will study this paradox, Professor HFY announced. You will learn about the attempts that have been made to solve it. You will understand why each attempt has failed. This will teach you humility in the face of the universe's mysteries. Jake barely heard the professor's words. He was too busy scribbling notes and sketching diagrams. In his mind, he was back in Professor Henderson's thermodynamics class at Kansas State. Professor Henderson had given them a problem about 3 different gases mixing in a container. The gases were supposed to react with each other, but they had reached a stable equilibrium instead. The solution had been simple once Jake realized that the gases were not actually touching each other directly. They were interacting through the container walls, which acted as a buffer between them. Could the same thing be happening in the Kepler 442 system, but on a massive scale? Student Morrison. Professor HFY's voice cut through Jake's thoughts. Are you paying attention? Jake looked up to find 300 pairs of eyes staring at him. He had been so focused on his calculations that he had missed whatever the professor had just said. Sorry, Professor, Jake said, feeling his face turn red. I was just taking notes. Good, the professor replied. Then you will have no trouble explaining to the class why the Kepler 442 paradox has remained unsolved for so long. Jake looked down at his tablet, then back up at the huge equation on the wall. His heart was beating fast, but not from nervousness. He was getting excited, the way he always did when he was close to solving a difficult problem. Actually, Professor, Jake said, raising his hand before he could stop himself, I think I might have an idea about that. The silence in the massive classroom was complete. Jake could hear his own heartbeat as 300 alien students turned to stare at him. Professor HFY's huge form floated motionless in his water tank, and Jake wondered if he had just made a terrible mistake. Student Morrison, the professor said slowly, did you just claim to have an idea about the Kepler 442 paradox? Jake swallowed hard. He looked around the room at all the alien faces watching him. The Trilarian students were flashing angry red colors through their crystal skin. The Vextar were clicking their mandibles in what Jake had learned was a sign of irritation. Even the gentle Nebulans had turned darker shades of blue. I might be wrong, Jake said quickly. I am still learning about exotic matter and quantum fields, but the basic structure of the problem looks familiar to me. A tall Altarian student stood up. His crystal body rang like a bell when he moved. Professor, surely we should not waste class time listening to a primitive Deathworlder discuss advanced physics. The human species has barely discovered faster than light travel. Other students murmured agreement. Jake felt his face getting hot with embarrassment. He started to put his tablet away, but Professor HFY made a deep humming sound that meant he wanted silence. Student Kethmar, the professor addressed the Altarian. Please remember that student Morrison qualified for admission to this institute through the same examinations as everyone else. His test scores were quite impressive. The professor's tank rotated until he was facing Jake directly. However, student Morrison, I must caution you about overconfidence. This problem has defeated minds far more experienced than yours. Perhaps you should focus on understanding the basics before attempting to critique the work of galactic civilization's greatest scientists. Jake nodded, but he could not stop looking at the equations on the wall. The more he studied them, the more convinced he became that everyone was making the problem much harder than it needed to be. It was like watching people try to solve a simple math problem using the most complicated method possible. Professor, Jake said, could you explain? What happens when the three types of exotic matter come into contact with each other? Professor HFY's breathing apparatus made a soft whistling sound. According to our calculations, they should undergo immediate mutual annihilation. The energy release would destroy not only the star system, but everything within several light years. But what if they never actually touch each other? Jake asked. The question seemed to surprise the professor. What do you mean, student Morrison? Jake stood up and walked to his tablet's display screen. His hands shook a little as he began to draw a simple diagram. Back on Earth, I learned about something called the three-body problem. When you have three objects that should attract each other, sometimes they find a stable balance instead of crashing together. The three-body problem is elementary orbital mechanics, scoffed a synthetic student whose metal body gleamed under the lights. It has nothing to do with exotic matter interactions. Maybe not directly, Jake said, still drawing on his tablet. But what if the three types of exotic matter are not interacting with each other at all? What if they are each interacting with something else? Professor HFY moved closer to Jake's display screen. Continue your explanation, student Morrison. Jake's diagram showed three circles arranged in a triangle pattern. The quantum field that surrounds the star system. What if the exotic matter is not touching the quantum field directly, but is instead affecting it? And what if the quantum field is affecting each type of exotic matter differently? The room was very quiet now. Jake could see that some students were starting to pay attention instead of just looking annoyed. Click, the Vextar student had turned all her compound eyes toward Jake's diagram. Think of it like this, Jake continued, getting more excited as he explained his idea. Imagine you have three people standing in a swimming pool. They are not touching each other, but they are all making waves in the water. The waves from each person affect the others, but the people themselves never come into contact. Jake started writing equations on his tablet, translating the complex alien mathematics into the simpler notation he had learned on Earth. If each type of exotic matter creates its own kind of distortion in the quantum field, and these distortions interact with each other instead of the matter itself, then you get a completely different set of equations. This is ridiculous, the Altarian student said. The Deathworlder is oversimplifying a problem that requires the most advanced mathematics in the galaxy. But Professor HFY was studying Jake's diagram very carefully. Student Morrison, your analogy is interesting, but the mathematics of exotic matter interactions are far more complex than swimming pool waves. I know that, Jake said. But maybe the complexity is hiding something simple underneath. In engineering school, we learned that the most elegant solutions are usually the simplest ones. Jake began writing faster, converting the alien equations into forms he could understand. Look, if you treat each type of exotic matter as a separate thermodynamic system, and the quantum field as the medium that connects them, then you can apply conservation of energy to each system individually. The equations on Jake's tablet were much simpler than the ones on the wall, but they seemed to describe the same physical situation. Several students had moved closer to see what Jake was doing. The key insight, Jake explained, is that the quantum field acts like a buffer between the three types of exotic matter. It prevents them from coming into direct contact, while still allowing them to influence each other. A Nebulan student floated down from the ceiling to get a better view. Their colors shifted from dark blue to bright yellow, which Jake had learned meant they were very interested in something. Student Morrison, Professor HFY said, your approach is creative, but I fail to see how it resolves the fundamental paradox. The mathematics still indicate that the system should be unstable. Jake was completely absorbed in his calculations now. He had forgotten about the hundreds of eyes watching him, forgotten about being the only human in the room. This was just a physics problem, and he loved solving physics problems. That is where everyone has been making the mistake, Jake said, looking up from his tablet. The system is not unstable. It is actually more stable than a normal star system. The room erupted in surprised voices. Students began talking to each other in dozens of different languages. The Trilarian students were flashing rapid color changes that Jake had never seen before. Impossible, declared the synthetic student. Our computer models have run billions of simulations. They all show system collapse within microseconds. Your computer models assume that the three types of exotic matter are trying to destroy each other, Jake replied. But what if they are actually working together? What if the quantum field allows them to form a stable partnership instead of a destructive competition? Jake turned back to his tablet and began writing a new set of equations. These were based on cooperation rather than conflict, on balance rather than destruction. The mathematics flowed naturally from his assumptions, leading to results that were both elegant and surprising. If I am right, Jake said, then the Kepler 442 system is not a paradox at all. It is an example of how the universe finds ways to create stability even under the most unlikely conditions. The equations on Jake's tablet showed a star system that was not only stable, but actually self-regulating. The three types of exotic matter, working through the quantum field, created a natural control system that prevented the star from either collapsing or exploding. It was like a cosmic thermostat that kept everything in perfect balance. Computer, Professor HFY said in a voice barely above a whisper, please analyze the equations on Student Morrison's display. The few seconds of processing time felt like hours to Jake. He suddenly realized what he had done. He had just claimed to solve a problem that had stumped the galaxy's greatest minds for over 1,000 years. Either he was about to be proven brilliantly right or embarrassingly wrong. The computer's neutral voice filled the silent classroom. Preliminary analysis suggests that the equations are mathematically consistent. However, full verification will require additional processing time. Jake's heart was pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. Around him, alien students were staring at his simple diagrams and equations with expressions he could not read. Had he just revolutionized galactic science or made the biggest fool of himself in the history of the universe? Professor HFY's tank moved until he was directly in front of Jake. Student Morrison, the professor said, I believe we need to have a very serious conversation. The computer processing seemed to take forever. Jake stood next to his tablet display, watching the alien students around him whisper to each other in their strange languages. Some looked angry, others confused, and a few seemed curious about what the human had done. Professor HFY floated silently in his tank, his huge eyes fixed on Jake's simple equations. Jake had never seen the professor look so serious before. The whale-like alien's breathing apparatus made soft, bubbling sounds that filled the quiet classroom. Computer, Professor HFY said again, what is the status of your analysis? Processing continues, the computer replied in its calm voice. The equations require translation between 17 different mathematical notation systems. Additional time needed for complete verification. Jake wiped his sweaty palms on his pants. He had been so confident when he was working through the problem, but now doubt was creeping in. What if he had made a simple mistake? What if his basic Earth mathematics were too primitive to handle advanced galactic physics? The Trilarian student named Vex High stood up again, his crystal body flashing bright red colors. Professor, this is a waste of our time. The Deathworlder has obviously made an error. Perhaps we should continue with the regular lesson. Sit down, student Vex High, Professor HFY said firmly. We will wait for the computer to finish. Jake looked around the room and saw that more professors had quietly entered. Dr. Yathara from the mathematics department stood near the back wall, her crystal form glowing with nervous energy. Professor Nexus, the artificial being who taught advanced quantum theory, had positioned himself where he could see both Jake's equations and the main display. "Student Morrison," Dr. Yathara called out, "could you explain your reasoning in more detail? Your approach seems to ignore several fundamental principles of exotic matter physics." Jake cleared his throat. His mouth felt very dry. "I am not ignoring them. I think I am just looking at them differently." He turned back to his tablet and began drawing another diagram. Everyone assumes that the three types of exotic matter are enemies that want to destroy each other. But what if they are more like dance partners who need to work together? The Nebulan student who had floated down earlier pulsed with bright yellow light. "Please explain this dance partner analogy, human Jake." "Well," Jake said, feeling a little more confident. "Imagine three people dancing together in a circle. If they all try to move in different directions, they will crash into each other. But if they move in harmony, they can create something beautiful." Jake drew 3 circles moving in a spiral pattern around a central point. "The quantum field is like the music that helps them dance together. It gives them the rhythm they need to avoid colliding. But the mathematics clearly show that exotic matter interactions are destructive," protested a Vextar student. "Our equations prove that mutual annihilation is inevitable." "Your equations assume that the interactions happen instantly and directly," Jake replied. "But what if there is a time delay? What if the quantum field slows down the interactions just enough to let the system find balance?" Jake started writing new equations on his tablet, showing how time delays could change everything. Think about driving a car. If you turn the steering wheel too fast, you will crash. But if you turn it slowly and smoothly, you can navigate even the sharpest curves. Professor Nexus stepped forward, his optical sensors glowing brightly. "Student Morrison, are you suggesting that the quantum field acts as a temporal buffer between the exotic matter types?" "Exactly," Jake said, getting excited again. "The quantum field does not just carry energy between the 3 types of matter. It also controls the timing of their interactions." The artificial professor's head tilted to one side, which Jake had learned meant he was processing complex calculations. "This would require the quantum field to have properties we have never observed before." "Or properties you never looked for," Jake said. "Sometimes the most important things are hidden in plain sight." The computer's voice interrupted their conversation. "Analysis 50% complete. Preliminary results show mathematical consistency across all tested parameters." A gasp went through the room. Several students began talking at once in their various languages. The sound was like being inside a zoo where all the animals were excited about something. "Silence," Professor Zephi commanded. His deep voice cut through the chatter like a knife. "Computer, continue your analysis." Jake noticed that his hands were shaking. He had been so focused on the problem that he had not fully understood what success would mean. If he was right, he had just solved one of the galaxy's greatest mysteries using nothing more than basic physics and common sense. Dr. Yathara moved closer to examine Jake's work. Her crystal body was now flashing colors Jake had never seen before, shifting rapidly between purple and gold. "Student Morrison, your mathematics appear sound, but the implications are disturbing." "Disturbing how?" Jake asked. "If a first-year student from a primitive world can solve this problem in one class period, what does that say about our advanced civilization?" she replied. "What does it say about the thousands of scientists who have worked on this problem for centuries?" Jake had not thought about that. He looked around the room at all the alien faces staring at him. These beings came from civilizations that had mastered space travel, created artificial intelligence, and unlocked the secrets of quantum physics thousands of years before humans had even invented the wheel. "Maybe," Jake said carefully, "it says that being advanced is not always better. Sometimes the simple way works when the complicated way does not." Professor Nexus made a sound that Jake thought might be laughter, though it was hard to tell with artificial beings. "The human suggests that our sophistication has become our weakness. It happens in engineering all the time," Jake explained. "When you make something too complex, it becomes fragile. Simple systems are often more reliable than complicated ones." The Vextar student Clicketh spoke up for the first time. Her voice sounded like wind chimes mixed with static. But surely the universe itself is complex. How can simple mathematics describe complex reality? Jake thought about how to answer that. The universe might be complex, but the rules it follows might be simple. Like a river. A river can be very complicated, with currents and eddies and rapids. But it all follows one simple rule. Water flows downhill. He turned back to his tablet and added a final set of equations. The Kepler 442 system looks complicated because we see 3 different types of exotic matter doing strange things. But underneath it is just following the simple rule that energy always seeks balance. Computer status report, Professor HFY demanded. Analysis 75% complete. All calculations verified as mathematically sound. Cross-referencing with observational data from the Kepler 442 system. The room was getting crowded now. Jake could see professors from other departments peering through the doorway. News of what was happening had apparently spread throughout the institute. Someone had even set up recording equipment to capture everything. Student Morrison, Professor HFY said, "Do you understand what you have accomplished here? If your solution is correct, you have solved one of the great unsolvables of galactic science." Jake shrugged. "I just used the same methods I learned in my engineering classes back home. Break the problem down into simple parts, look for patterns, and do not make things more complicated than they need to be. But this problem has defeated our greatest minds," Dr. Yathara said. The Trilarian Mathematics Guild spent 2 centuries developing new mathematical tools specifically for this paradox. Maybe that was the problem, Jake said. Maybe they developed tools that were too specialized. Sometimes you need to step back and use basic tools instead of fancy ones. The computer's voice filled the room again. Analysis 90% complete. Solution confirmed mathematically sound and consistent with all observational data from the Kepler 442 system. The silence that followed was different from before. It was not the silence of waiting, but the silence of shock. Jake could see the realization dawning on the faces around him. He had actually done it. A human student had solved the impossible problem. "Computer," Professor HFY said in a whisper. "Final verification. Analysis complete. The Morrison solution is mathematically sound, physically consistent, and explains all observed phenomena in the Kepler 442 system. The solution is verified correct." The classroom erupted in chaos. The chaos in the classroom was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. Students were jumping up from their seats, talking loudly in dozens of different languages. The Trilarian students were flashing colors so rapidly that they looked like living disco balls. The Vextar were clicking their mandibles so fast it sounded like machine gun fire. Even the calm Nebulans were swirling around in excited circles near the ceiling. Jake stood frozen next to his tablet, not sure what to do. He had expected the aliens to be happy that the problem was solved, but instead, they seemed panicked and upset. Professor HFY was making deep rumbling sounds in his tank that Jake had never heard before. "This cannot be happening," Dr. Yathara said, her crystal body pulsing with angry red light. "The Trilarian Mathematics Guild has devoted centuries to this problem. Our greatest minds have examined every possible approach. The observational data must be wrong," declared the synthetic student who had been skeptical before. "Our computer models are based on the most advanced physics in the galaxy. They cannot all be incorrect." Professor Nexus had moved closer to Jake's display and was scanning the equations with his optical sensors. "The mathematics are undeniably correct," he said in his mechanical voice. "I have run the calculations through my own processing systems. The solution is valid." Jake finally found his voice. "Why is everyone so upset? I thought you would be happy that the problem is solved." Dr. Yathara turned to face him, her crystal form now glowing with what Jake was learning to recognize as distress. "Student Morrison, do you not understand what you have done? You have just proven that our most advanced scientific methods are inferior to the basic techniques of a primitive species." "I would not call humans primitive," Professor HFY said, though his voice sounded shaky. "Perhaps we should say they have a different approach to problem solving." "Different?" The Altarian student Kethamar stood up again, his crystal body ringing like a broken bell. The Deathworlder solved in one class period what our civilization could not solve in a millennium. This is not different. This is humiliating. More professors had crowded into the classroom. Jake could see department heads and senior research fellows pushing through the doorway. Someone had activated the emergency communication system, and Jake could hear announcements being made throughout the institute. Emergency faculty meeting in Conference Hall Alpha. A voice announced over the speakers. All department heads report, immediately. Priority 1, academic crisis in progress. Jake felt his stomach drop. Did they just call me a crisis? Professor Nexus turned his optical sensors toward Jake. Student Morrison, I believe you have created the biggest academic emergency in galactic history. A small Zephyrian professor that Jake recognized from the physics department pushed her way to the front of the crowd. Her feathered body was trembling with excitement. Student Morrison, could you examine other problems using your method? We have 12 theoretical puzzles that have been considered unsolvable for centuries. Professor Kithala, Dr. Yathara said sharply, we should not encourage this further until we understand what has happened here. What has happened is obvious, Professor Kithala replied. The human has demonstrated that our approach to advanced physics is fundamentally flawed. Jake raised his hand like he was back in high school. Excuse me, but I do not think my approach is better than yours. It is just different. Maybe we could work together instead of competing. The suggestion seemed to make things worse. Several professors began talking at once, their voices overlapping in a confusing mix of languages and translation static. Work together? The synthetic student sounded offended. Our civilization has mastered technologies beyond your comprehension. We have conquered space, time, and matter itself. What could we possibly learn from a species that still uses chemical rockets? Jake was starting to get annoyed. He had been polite and humble, but these aliens were acting like jerks. Maybe you could learn that chemical rockets actually work pretty well. They got me here, did they not? Professor HFY made that rumbling sound again. Student Morrison has a valid point. Perhaps our advanced technologies have made us forget the value of simple, reliable methods. Simple methods are for simple minds, Kethmar declared. The universe is complex, it requires complex solutions. The universe is complex, Jake agreed. But that does not mean the solutions have to be. Sometimes the most complex problems have the simplest answers. He walked over to the main display and pointed at the original equations. Look at this problem. You made it complicated by assuming the worst-case scenario. You assumed the 3 types of exotic matter would try to destroy each other. But what if they do not want to fight? What if they want to cooperate? Exotic matter does not want anything, Dr. Yathara said coldly. It is not alive. It follows the laws of physics. Right, Jake said. But the laws of physics include cooperation, not just competition. Gravity makes planets orbit stars instead of crashing into them. Electromagnetic forces hold atoms together instead of tearing them apart. The universe is full of examples of things working together. A new voice spoke from the back of the room. The human is correct. Everyone turned to see who had spoken. Jake gasped when he saw the newcomer. It was one of the void-touched, beings so advanced that they rarely bothered to communicate with other species. The creature looked like a shadow wearing robes made of starlight. Elder Vashtai, Professor HFY said with obvious respect. We did not expect your presence. We sensed a disturbance in the academic realm, the void-touched replied, its voice seeming to come from everywhere at once. We came to investigate and found something most interesting. The shadow being glided over to Jake's display. The human child has solved a problem that we ourselves could not resolve. This is unprecedented in our experience. Jake felt his knees go weak. The void-touched were supposed to be the smartest beings in the galaxy. If they could not solve the problem either, then maybe he really had done something incredible. Elder Vashtai, Dr. Yathara said carefully. Surely your people could have solved this problem if you had devoted sufficient resources to it. We devoted considerable resources, the void-touched replied. We expanded our consciousness beyond normal limits. We explored dimensions of mathematics that other species cannot perceive. We found nothing but complexity leading to greater complexity. The idea being turned toward Jake, though it was hard to tell since it had no visible face. The human succeeded because he ignored our advanced methods entirely. He used principles so basic that we had forgotten they existed. This is exactly what I was afraid of, Dr. Yathara said. If our advanced methods are useless, then what is the point of our civilization? What is the point of our technology and our accumulated knowledge? Jake felt sorry for the crystal alien. She seemed genuinely upset about having her worldview challenged. Your technology and knowledge are not useless. They are amazing. But maybe they work better when you combine them with simple approaches instead of trying to replace simple approaches. The human speaks wisdom, Elder Vashti said. Perhaps it is time for our civilizations to learn humility. Professor Nexus had been quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke up. I have been analyzing the implications of Student Morrison's solution. If his approach can be applied to other unsolved problems, it could revolutionize galactic science. That is what terrifies me, Dr. Yathara admitted. What if we discover that most of our great mysteries can be solved by any first-year student with basic mathematics? Jake looked around the crowded classroom at all the worried alien faces. He was starting to understand why they were so upset. It was not just about solving one problem. It was about everything they believed about intelligence and advancement being called into question. Maybe, Jake said quietly, the real mystery is not why the Kepler 442 system exists. Maybe the real mystery is why you all convinced yourselves it was impossible to understand. The silence that followed his words was the deepest yet. Even the void touched seemed to be considering what Jake had said. Professor Zephi finally broke the silence. Student Morrison, I believe you have given us much to think about. Class is dismissed. As the alien students began filing out of the room, Jake could hear them talking in worried whispers. Word of what had happened was spreading throughout the institute like wildfire. By tomorrow, the entire galaxy would know that a human had solved the unsolvable. Jake gathered his things and started toward the door, but Professor Zephi called him back. Student Morrison, please remain. We need to discuss your future here at the Institute. Jake had a feeling that his quiet life as an exchange student was about to become much more complicated. 3 days after Jake solved the Kepler 442 paradox, the Zirian Institute had become the center of the biggest academic crisis in galactic history. Ships arrived hourly from every corner of known space, carrying scientists, professors, and government, officials who all wanted to meet the human who had changed everything. Jake sat in what used to be a quiet study room, but was now surrounded by recording equipment and translation devices. Across from him sat Dr. Henway, the director of the Galactic Science Council, a distinguished Aquarian whose blue skin rippled with nervous patterns. Student Morrison, Dr. Henway said, in 3 days you have solved not just the Kepler 442 paradox, but also the dimensional fold theorem, the Trilarian prime equation, and the nexus point calculation. 4 problems that have stumped our greatest minds for centuries. Jake shrugged. They were not that different from the first one. Once you realize that most systems want to find balance instead of destroying themselves, the mathematics become much simpler. Through the window, Jake could see crowds of alien reporters and scientists gathered outside the institute. Some were protesting, holding signs that said things like "Preserve galactic science standards and advanced methods matter." Others seemed excited, carrying banners reading, "Embrace human wisdom," and "Simple solutions save time." The reactions across the galaxy have been intense, Dr. Henway continued. The Trilarian Mathematics Guild has called for an emergency session to review all their unsolved problems. The Synthetic Collective has begun reprogramming their thinking algorithms. 3 universities have already created new departments dedicated to studying human problem-solving methods. Jake felt overwhelmed. I never wanted to cause so much trouble. I was just trying to pass my classes. Professor Zephi entered the room, his massive tank barely fitting through the doorway. Behind him came Elder Vashti, the void touched, whose shadow form seemed to absorb light from the room. Student Morrison, Professor HFY said. We have received communication requests from over 200 academic institutions across 47 star systems. Everyone wants to offer you research positions, professorships, or consulting contracts. The HFY Emperor of the Trilarian Empire has personally requested that you visit their capital world, Dr. Henway added. The Synthetic Collective wants to create artificial copies of your thought patterns. The Nebulan Confederation is offering to make you an honorary cloud citizen. Jake looked around at all the important aliens staring at him. A week ago, he had been nobody special, just another exchange student trying to keep up with his alien classmates. Now he was apparently the most famous human in the galaxy. What I do not understand, Jake said, is why everyone is so surprised. Humans have been solving problems for thousands of years. We had to, or we would have gone extinct on Earth. Elder Vashatai glided closer. That is precisely what makes your species so remarkable. Most civilizations develop advanced technology and then forget how to think simply. Humans developed advanced technology while keeping their simple thinking. But simple thinking is not supposed to work on advanced problems, Dr. Henway protested. That is why we developed advanced thinking in the first place. Maybe, Jake said. Advanced problems need both kinds of thinking, like using a hammer and a screwdriver to build something. You do not throw away the hammer just because you learned how to use the screwdriver. Professor HFY made a sound that Jake had learned meant deep thought. Student Morrison, we have been analyzing the teaching methods used in Earth universities. Your professors seem to emphasize practical problem-solving over theoretical complexity. Yeah, Jake agreed. My engineering professors always said the best solution is the one that works, not the one that looks impressive on paper. This philosophy appears to be fundamentally different from galactic academic tradition, Dr. Henway observed. We have always believed that the most sophisticated solution must be the correct one. Jake stood up and walked to the window. Below, he could see alien students walking between buildings, going to their classes just like students everywhere. Maybe that is the real problem. Maybe you have been trying so hard to be sophisticated that you forgot to be practical. The human speaks truth, Elder Vashatai said. We void-touched have spent eons expanding our consciousness to perceive higher dimensions of reality. But perhaps we have expanded so far that we can no longer see the simple truths in front of us. A new voice spoke from the doorway. Excuse me, but I think there might be a way to fix this. Everyone turned to see Clicth, the Vextar student from Jake's physics class. Her compound eyes reflected nervously as she entered the room. Student Clicketh, Professor HFY said with surprise. What do you mean? I have been thinking about what human Jake said about cooperation, she explained, her voice sounding like wind chimes. What if we do not have to choose between simple thinking and advanced thinking? What if we combine them? Jake smiled. That is exactly what I was hoping someone would say. Clickth moved closer to the group. I propose we create mixed study groups. Human students working with alien students. Simple methods working with advanced methods. Maybe together we can solve problems that neither approach could handle alone. Dr. Henway's skin patterns shifted to show interest. An intriguing concept. But would human students be able to keep up with our advanced coursework? Would alien students be able to keep up with human practical thinking? Jake asked back. I think we would all learn from each other. Elder Vashatai seemed to consider this. The Void-Touched Collective would be interested in participating in such an experiment. We wish to understand how consciousness can be both expanded and focused simultaneously. Professor HFY was getting excited now, his breathing apparatus bubbling faster. We could establish exchange programs between Earth universities and galactic institutions. Human professors could teach practical problem-solving, while our professors teach advanced theory. The Trilarian Mathematics Guild would resist such changes, Dr. Henway warned. They have invested too much pride in their traditional methods. Jake walked back to the group. Then maybe we start small. A few pilot programs to show that cooperation works better than competition. Once people see the results, they will want to join in. You make it sound simple, Dr. Henway said. It is simple, Jake replied. That is the point. Over the next few hours, They worked out the details of what they started calling the Cooperative Learning Initiative. Earth would send more students to galactic universities, while alien students would visit Earth to learn human teaching methods. Research teams would be mixed, combining species and approaches. "There is one more thing," Jake said as they finished planning. "I want to make it clear that humans are not smarter than other species. We just think differently. Everyone has something valuable to contribute." Spoken like a true teacher, Professor HFY observed. "Student Morrison, I believe you have a natural gift for education." As the meeting ended and the important aliens left to begin implementing their plans, Jake found himself alone with Click. The Vextar student had stayed behind to help clean up the recording equipment. "Human Jake," she said, "why did you not take credit for being superior to us? You could have demanded anything you wanted." Jake thought about her question. "Because that would not have solved anything. If I had acted superior, you all would have resented me and humans. This way we can work together and everyone benefits." "You truly think we are equals?" Click asked. "I think we are different," Jake said, "and different can be really good if you use it right." 6 months later, the galaxy had changed in ways nobody expected. The first mixed research teams had solved 3 more ancient problems. Human students were teaching practical thinking courses at universities across 40 star systems. Alien students studying on Earth were helping human scientists understand technologies they had only dreamed about. Jake had become famous, but not in the way he had feared. Instead of being seen as the human who proved aliens wrong, he was known as the student who proved that cooperation was better than competition. The Kepler 442 paradox was no longer considered a paradox at all. It was simply an example of how the universe preferred balance over chaos, cooperation over conflict. And Jake Morrison, the engineering student from Kansas, had learned that sometimes the most important problems to solve were not scientific equations, but the relationships between the people trying to solve them. On quiet nights, when he looked up at the stars visible from the Zerion Institute, Jake still could not quite believe what had happened. He had come to the galaxy to learn about advanced science, but instead he had taught an entire civilization something much more valuable. He had taught them that being smart was not about having the most complex answers. It was about asking the right questions and being willing to listen to the answers, no matter how simple they might be.